The lamp was already lit when Stephen Malone pulled himself out of the flooded creek at 2 minutes past midnight, water streaming from his coat, his badge catching the pale moonlight like a confession he hadn't meant to make. His boots were filled with cold mud. His hands were numb to the bone. And the lamp in his saddlebag, miraculously still burning after everything the current had thrown at him, cast a trembling circle of gold across the dark Texas soil as he stood there on the far bank, chest heaving, staring up at the window of Matilda Keller's farmhouse. He had almost drowned for this. Not for the law, not for duty. Not for the badge on his chest that Sheriff Randall Hicks had pressed into his palm 4 years ago with a warning that amounted to a threat. He had crossed that flooded, raging creek at midnight for a woman who had made it unmistakably clear, in front of half the town of Caldwell Creek, that she wanted nothing to do with him. The words she had said 3 days ago still lived behind his ribs like a knife that hadn't finished its work. "You are exactly like every other man in this county who wears a badge and calls it integrity," she had said, her voice low and controlled, which was somehow worse than screaming. "You carry other people's secrets in your pocket and call it justice. You have a dark past you think nobody can see, Stephen Malone, and you use that star on your chest to keep the world at arm's length. Don't you dare pretend you came here for me." She had turned her back on him then, walked into her farmhouse and closed the door. He had stood on her porch for a full minute, rain starting to fall, unable to move because she had been right about everything except the last part. He had come there entirely for her. He had come for her the way a man comes for air, when the water is already over his head. Now he stood on the wrong side of a flooded creek in the middle of the night, soaked through to his soul, holding a lamp he had protected across 12 yards of churning water, and he could not for the life of him explain why he thought this was a rational decision. He only knew that she was alone in that farmhouse, that the storm had knocked out every light for miles, that her nearest neighbor was 4 miles east, and that somewhere between the sheriff's office and the edge of town, he had made a choice that had nothing to do with reason. He crossed the open ground between the creek bank and her farmhouse slowly, his boots leaving dark prints in the wet earth, and when he reached her front window, he set the lamp on the sill where it would throw its light inside, where she would see it the moment she woke. He did not knock. He did not call her name. He simply stood there for a moment, breathing the wet night air, watching the flame hold steady behind the glass, and then he turned to walk back into the dark. He had not taken 3 steps when the front door opened. Matilda Keller stood in the doorway in her nightgown, a wool blanket pulled tight around her shoulders, her dark hair loose and tangled from sleep. She was holding a Springfield single-shot rifle with the practiced ease of a woman who had been on the frontier long enough to learn that the sound of something outside at midnight was never something you ignored. Her eyes found him immediately in the darkness, and for a long moment neither of them spoke. "You are soaking wet," she said finally. "Creek flooded," he said. She looked at the lamp on her windowsill. She looked back at him. "You crossed the flooded creek," she said slowly, and it was not entirely a question. "At midnight, to leave a lamp at my window." "Your light was out," he said. "Whole territory's dark, thought you might need it." The silence between them stretched like something alive. "You almost drowned yourself," she said, and her voice had changed. The controlled, careful distance she had built over the past 3 days was cracking somewhere at the edges, and he could hear it, though he was not yet sure what was underneath. "I've crossed worse," he said, which was not entirely true. She studied him for another long moment, the rifle lowering by degrees she seemed unaware of, and then she stepped back from the doorway. "Get inside before you die of cold, Stephen Malone," she said. "And then you are going to tell me the truth, all of it. The dark past, the secrets, the hidden motives, everything." He walked toward the light she had led him into, and for the first time in 4 years he felt something in his chest shift like a door coming off its hinges. This is how it had started. Or rather, this is where it had arrived. The starting place was somewhere else entirely, 8 months earlier. On the day Matilda Keller's wagon rolled into Caldwell Creek with a cracked axle, 3 trunks, and a letter of ownership for 40 acres of bottomland that everyone in the county agreed she would never be able to work alone. The town of Caldwell Creek sat in the rolling limestone hills of central Texas in the autumn of 1882, and it had the particular quality of a place that had survived several varieties of disaster and was beginning to feel comfortable about it. The railroad had come through 2 years prior, bringing commerce and trouble in roughly equal measure. The cattle drives still moved north through the county every spring, and the men who followed them were not always the kind who knew how to behave indoors. There was a proper bank, a hotel, a general store run by a man named Ezra Bloom who knew everyone's business, a church, a schoolhouse, and a saloon called the Red Elk that did more business than any of the above. Stephen Malone had been deputy to Sheriff Randall Hicks for 4 years by the autumn of 1882, and in those 4 years he had built a reputation that the town found useful and somewhat unsettling. He was not a talkative man. He was not a man given to displays of warmth or comfort. He had a way of standing in doorways that made people reconsider whatever they had been about to do, and he had the kind of face that had been through enough weather, both literal and otherwise, that it was difficult to read without knowing where to look. He was 31 years old. He had grown up in Abilene, Kansas, which had been a harder town than it was now, and he had left it at 19 under circumstances that he had never discussed with anyone in Caldwell Creek, and which were the specific dark past that Matilda Keller would later accuse him of carrying. He was capable of kindness in the way that a man is capable of it when he has spent a long time being afraid of what it costs. He had not been planning to fall in love with anyone. He had, in fact, made a private compact with himself on this subject, sometime around his 27th year, after the last time love had ended in a manner that cost him considerably more than his pride. The compact was simple: do the work, keep the peace, earn the trust of the town, and leave the rest of it alone. He had been successfully keeping this compact for 4 years when Matilda Keller's wagon wheel cracked on the main street of Caldwell Creek on a Tuesday afternoon in late September, and he was the one who happened to be standing closest when it happened. She had not asked for help. That was the first thing he noticed. Most people, wagon axle cracking under them, would have called out or flagged someone down or at minimum made some sound of distress. Matilda Keller climbed down from the wagon seat, walked around to examine the wheel with the focused attention of a woman conducting an inspection, and then stood up straight and looked down the street as though calculating the distance to the nearest wheelwright. "Miss," he said, approaching from the boardwalk, "you need assistance." She looked at him, and he had the slightly disorienting experience of being assessed very thoroughly by a pair of dark brown eyes that seemed to be deciding whether he was useful or merely present. "Is there a wheelwright in this town?" she asked. "Bert Galloway, end of the street left side. He'll have you sorted by morning." "By morning," she repeated, and he could hear the problem in it. "If you need storage for your belongings tonight, the hotel has a back room." "I need my belongings kept safe, not stored," she said, and the distinction was not lost on him. "I can have a word with Bert," he said. "Make sure your wagon stays where it is until he gets to it. Nobody will touch it." She studied him again, and then her eyes dropped to his badge. "Deputy," she said. "Yes, ma'am, Stephen Malone." "Matilda Keller," she said, and she put her hand out in the businesslike way of a person who had learned to conduct herself as though handshakes were not remarkable, even when the person she was offering one to had clearly not been expecting it. He shook her hand. Her grip was firm. There was a callus on her palm that spoke to years of real work. "I own 40 acres south of town," she told him, "on the creek. I have a letter from the land office in Austin to prove it if that becomes necessary." "It won't," he said, though something in her tone suggested she expected it might, and she had probably had good reason for that expectation in other places. "I'll be needing to know where I stand with the people in this town," she said, "before I put down roots." "That's a reasonable thing to want to know," he said. "Are there people here who will give me trouble about a woman owning land alone?" He considered this honestly. "There are people here who will have opinions," he said. "There are 2 or 3 who might make those opinions into action. I wouldn't lose sleep over it, but I wouldn't ignore it either." She nodded, as though this was the answer she had expected and had already decided how to respond to it. "I appreciate the honesty," she said. He helped her get her 3 trunks moved to the hotel, spoke to Bert Galloway about the wagon, and watched her walk across the lobby of the Caldwell Creek Hotel with the unhurried certainty of a woman who had walked into harder rooms than this and had not yet found one she couldn't handle. He stood on the boardwalk for longer than was strictly necessary after she went inside, and then he walked back to the sheriff's office, where Randall Hicks was tilted back in his chair reading a 3-week-old newspaper. "Saw you helping the new arrival," Randall said without looking up. "Cracked axle," Stephen said. "Pretty woman," Randall said. "That's got nothing to do with it," Stephen said. Randall put down the paper and looked at him with the expression of a man who had known Stephen Malone long enough to find certain denials amusing. "Of course not," Randall said. Stephen did not dignify this with a response. The following weeks brought October, which in Central Texas in 1882 was a season of sharp blue skies and mornings that arrived cold enough to mean business. The cattle drives had thinned out. The railroad brought new settlers through in small groups, a family here, a pair of brothers there, people with that particular look of those who had left somewhere difficult and were not yet sure what they had arrived at. Matilda Keller moved onto her 40 acres at the end of the first week. The farmhouse was standing, which she had apparently been told might or might not be the case, and she set about making it habitable with a speed and efficiency that became something of a topic of conversation in town. Ezra Bloom at the general store reported that she bought the right things, which in his assessment meant she knew what she was doing. The widow Hannah Prout, who lived 2 miles north and had the instincts of a natural alliance builder, rode over to introduce herself in the second week and came back saying that Matilda Keller was one of the most sensible people she had met in her 43 years on Earth. Stephen did not ride out to her farm in those first weeks. He had no official reason to, and he was very careful about operating within official reasons. What he did do was make sure that the 2 men in town most likely to make her life difficult, a cattle broker named Doyle Ferris and his brother Kurt, were aware in the early and unambiguous way that a deputy's presence implies, that the new land south of the creek was properly deeded, and that its owner had the full support of the law. Doyle Ferris was not a man who respected the law so much as he respected the inconvenience it could cause him. He listened to Stephen's implicit message, decided it outweighed the potential gain, and went back to his cattle brokering. His brother Kurt was less rational, but Kurt was generally less rational about everything, and that was a complication that would arrive later. Stephen's first real conversation with Matilda after the day of the broken wheel happened at the general store in the 3rd week of October. She was there selecting seed packets and a new length of fence wire, and he was there because Ezra Bloom was also the informal message center for the county, and Stephen made a point of checking in twice a week. They found themselves at the counter at the same time, and Ezra, who had the social instincts of someone who thoroughly enjoyed watching things develop, made himself busy at the far end of the store for an extended period. "How is the land coming?" Stephen asked. "There is more work than time," she said, which was not a complaint, simply an accounting of facts. "I need to get the roof properly weathered before winter. The well is good. The creek is useful, but I'll need to be careful of it when the rains come." "It floods," he confirmed. "Comes up fast when there's heavy rain upstream. Can come 3 feet over the bank in the space of a few hours." "I'll keep that in mind," she said. She glanced at him sideways with a look that was not entirely unfriendly. "You have been keeping the Ferris brothers at a distance. I am aware of that." He was mildly surprised she knew. "Part of the job," he said. She said, in a tone that suggested she knew the difference between part of the job and a choice being made. "Thank you." "You're welcome," he said. There was a pause in which both of them looked at the seed packets on the counter, and then she said, "I have coffee on in the mornings. if you are ever passing that way on official business." It was the most carefully calibrated invitation he had ever received. It was offering him exactly 1 inch of ground. "I'll bear that in mind," he said, in a tone that acknowledged the inch without stepping onto it prematurely. She bought her seed packets and her fence wire and left, and Ezra Bloom came back to the near end of the counter with an expression that Stephen elected not to engage with. November came in with rain. Not the dramatic flooding rain of spring, but the steady, gray, purposeful rain of late autumn that soaked into everything and turned the roads to ribbons of mud and made the cattle miserable and the farmers vigilant. Stephen began riding the South Road as a regular part of his patrol, which was justifiable on multiple grounds that had nothing to do with the fact that the road passed within a quarter-mile of Matilda Keller's farmhouse. He stopped for coffee twice in the first half of November, both times on valid pretexts: a report of cattle straying near the creek, and a question about a signature on a property document that the land office had sent her by way of his office. Both times they sat at her kitchen table with their cups and talked about practical things: the farm, the town, the approaching winter, the state of the roads. Both times he left having learned something about her that he had not known before, and having noticed with increasing clarity that this was becoming a problem for his compact. She had come from a town in Missouri called Holt's Ford, she told him on the second visit, in the way that people mention a place when they want to be honest about it without making it larger than it needs to be. She had been married. Her husband had died 3 years ago, of fever, which was a common way for people to die in that era and no less devastating for that. She had stayed in Holt's Ford for 2 years after, and then she had made the decision to go west, which was not an easy decision and not an obvious one, and which had required a kind of internal calculus that she described with a brevity that told him more than a longer account would have. "There was nothing keeping me there except the weight of what had already happened," she said, "and I have found that weight does not diminish with proximity. It diminishes with forward motion." He sat with this for a moment. "That sounds like experience talking," he said. "It is," she said. She looked at him with that direct, assessing quality that he was beginning to understand was simply how she looked at everything she considered worth understanding. "You know something about it." It was not quite a question. "I might," he said. "You don't have to tell me," she said. "I'm not asking." But she was asking, in the way that honest people ask things without demanding them, by making it safe to answer. He thought about Abilene, and about what he had left there, and about the reason he had spent 4 years making himself useful and contained, and professionally, above reproach in a town that did not know where he had come from. "I will tell you eventually," he said, and he meant it, which surprised him. She nodded, as though this was a reasonable timeline, and refilled his cup. By the end of November he was stopping for coffee with regularity, and the pretexts had become more perfunctory, and neither of them commented on this development. He helped her reinforce the roof one Saturday, not because he had been asked, but because the weather report from the railroad men suggested a hard rain was coming, and the patch on the northeast corner was not going to hold. She had accepted his help without performance, put him to work with specific instructions, and fed him supper afterwards, and they had sat on her porch in the cold early dark and talked for 2 hours about things that were not pretexts at all. She told him about her father, who had been a school teacher in Missouri and had taught her to read Latin, which she found useful for the precision it gave to other languages. She told him she had considered a teaching position when she moved west, but had decided that owning land was a more permanent form of security. He told her about his mother, who had made the best decisions available to her in circumstances that did not offer many, and about his father, who had not been present to speak of, and about the years in Abilene that had built him and then nearly undone him. He stopped short of the specific thing he had not told anyone, but he went closer to it than he had gone with any other human being in 4 years, and when he stopped, she did not push him past where he had chosen to stop. "You will tell me when you're ready," she said. "Or you won't. Either way, I know enough of the shape of it to know it does not make you the man you would be if you had made a different choice. And that matters to me." He looked at her in the dim porch light, the cold air between them carrying the smell of wood smoke and coming rain, and he felt the compact he had made with himself begin to develop a serious structural problem. December arrived, and with it, a crisis that had been building under the surface of things, the way water builds under frozen ground. Kurt Ferris had been drinking steadily through the autumn with the specific purpose of accumulating grievances. He had lost a cattle deal in October that he blamed, inaccurately, on a competitor named Peters. But by the time December arrived, the blame had migrated to the general concept of outside forces, disrupting what he felt was rightfully his territory. Matilda Keller's 40 acres on the creek represented, in Kurt Ferris's increasingly irrational accounting, a parcel that should have been available to the Ferris family when old Roy McKell's estate had been settled. And the fact that a woman from Missouri had arrived and taken it legitimately made the loss feel personal in a way that legitimate processes do not generally justify. On the 3rd of December, Kurt Ferris rode down to Matilda's farm while his brother was in San Antonio on business, which meant there was no one to moderate him. Stephen was at his office when Hannah Prout rode in at a full gallop, which was unusual enough to get him on his horse in 30 seconds flat. "Kurt Ferris is at Matilda's place," Hannah said, her voice tight and controlled. "He has been drinking since morning, and he rode down there with 2 of his hired hands. I saw them from the North Road." Stephen was moving before she finished the sentence. He arrived at Matilda's farm to find Kurt Ferris on horseback in her yard, red-faced and loud, his 2 hired hands flanking him with the look of men who were embarrassed by their employer and not sure what to do about it. Matilda was standing on her porch, her rifle at her side with the barrel pointed at the ground, and her face had the particular controlled expression that Stephen had come to recognize as her at her most dangerous, which was to say her most precise. "Kurt," Stephen said, putting his horse between Ferris and the porch with a movement that was purely physical statement, "you need to ride back to town." "This is county land business," Kurt said, slurring the edges of the sentence. "Nothing to do with the law. It has everything to do with the law when a man rides to a woman's property with 2 armed hands and a bottle," Stephen said. He kept his voice level and matter of fact, which was more intimidating than loudness. "The deed to this land is in order, registered with the county, filed in Austin. There is no land business here. Ride home." Kurt Ferris looked at him with the particular resentment of a man who is being denied something he told himself he deserved. "You have been riding down this road every week," Kurt said, with the cunning of the drunk. "I know what that's about. You think you have a claim here too." The air in the yard went very still. "I am the law in this county," Stephen said. "I patrol the roads, that's the end of it. Last time I will say it, Kurt, ride home." The hired hands, who were not paid enough for whatever this was becoming, exchanged a look. The one on the left nudged his horse sideways in the direction of the gate. The one on the right followed. Kurt Ferris sat there for another long moment, his face working through something, and then the anger in him seemed to leak out through the alcohol and leave only a deflated, embarrassed man sitting on a horse in a stranger's yard. He turned his horse and rode out. Stephen waited until they were gone from sight, then dismounted and tied his horse to the fence. He walked to the porch. "Are you all right?" he asked. "I am perfectly fine," she said, which was true. She had not moved from the porch. "I would have handled it." "I know you would have," he said. Something in her expression changed at that. She had been expecting him to dispute it, he realized. She had been prepared to defend herself against someone telling her she needed saving. "You do know that," she said, with a kind of quiet surprise. "I came because I was close and he had 2 hands with him," Stephen said. "Not because I thought you couldn't manage one drunk man." She looked at him for a long moment. "Come in," she said. "Coffee." He tied his horse. He went inside. They sat at her kitchen table and drank coffee and did not talk about Kurt Ferris because there was nothing more to say about him, and instead talked about the winter, which was coming hard, and about the book she was reading, which was a collection of essays that she had ordered from a catalog and which had arrived in worse condition than hoped but readable. He stayed 2 hours, longer than he had ever stayed before, and when he finally stood to leave, she walked him to the door and they stood in the open doorway with the cold December night pressing in, and the space between them was full of something that neither of them named but both of them felt with considerable clarity. "Stephen," she said, which was the first time she had used his given name outside of the formal introduction. "Yes," he said. She looked at him with those direct brown eyes, and for a moment he thought she was going to say something that would change the geography of things between them entirely. But she said, "Be careful on the road. It's icy past the creek crossing." "I will," he said. He rode back to town in the dark, ice cracking under his horse's hooves, and he let himself be completely honest with himself for the first time about the fact that the compact he had made at 27 was now in serious danger of becoming irrelevant. January brought a discovery that Stephen had been quietly dreading since the autumn, the specific gravity of his dark past making itself felt with a particular kind of timing that he should perhaps have anticipated. A man arrived on the January Railroad from Kansas City, a man named Vic Halley, who was a former associate of a former sheriff in Abilene, and who knew things about Stephen Malone's history that Stephen had been keeping folded and locked and thoroughly out of sight in Caldwell Creek for 4 years. Stephen saw Halley in the hotel dining room on the evening of Halley's arrival, and the world contracted sharply around him in the way it does when a past you have been running from stops running and simply stands there in the dining room eating beef stew. Vic Halley was not a violent man, and he was not precisely a blackmailer. He was something worse. He was a man who simply talked, freely and without malice, about things he knew because he saw no particular reason not to. He had no agenda against Stephen Malone. He had simply arrived in Caldwell Creek for cattle business and brought 12 years of shared history with him, none of which Stephen had disclosed to the people who trusted him. Stephen went to see him that same evening after the dinner crowd had thinned. "Malone," Halley said, with genuine pleasure. "I'll be damned. Heard you were lawing it somewhere in Texas." "Halley," Stephen said, sitting down across from him, "I need a conversation with you." What emerged from that conversation, over the next 2 hours, was the shape of what Stephen had carried out of Abilene at 19 years old. In the winter of 1870, at 19, Stephen Malone had been working for a man named Frank Dodd, who ran a trading operation out of Abilene that was not entirely legal and was not entirely illegal, occupying the gray space that the frontier was full of in that era. Frank Dodd had a partner named Lester Crane who was conducting a separate, significantly more illegal operation on the side, running stolen cattle through the trading outfit without Dodd's knowledge. When the scheme had unraveled, the law in Abilene had come down on everyone associated with Dodd's operation, legal or not, and Stephen, 19 and terrified, and not yet the man he would become, had given testimony that protected Dodd from culpability for Crane's crimes. This testimony was accurate. Crane was guilty. Dodd was not. The testimony was honest. But in giving it, Stephen had also, under pressure from the investigating sheriff, disclosed information about the movements of a third man, a man named Tom Fairley, who was a small-time fence for stolen goods and who was peripherally connected to Crane. That information had led to Tom Fairley's arrest. Fairley had died in custody of a heart condition nobody had known about 4 days after his arrest. Tom Fairley had a wife and 2 young sons. Stephen had spent 12 years telling himself that the testimony was accurate, that Fairley was guilty, that the heart condition was not his responsibility. He had spent 12 years being unable to fully believe it. He had left Abilene because staying there meant walking past Fairley's widow every week, and he had not been able to do that and remain functional. He had come to Texas and built himself into a better man, and he had told nobody, and he had carried it. Vic Haley knew all of this. Haley himself had no culpability in the matter. He had been a ranch hand at the time and was simply a witness to events. He harbored no particular judgment about it, but he would talk about it, not out of malice, simply because it was history. "I'm not planning to broadcast your business," Haley told him, when Stephen had laid out his concern with the plainness of a man who was tired of carrying something alone. "I'm here for cattle brokering, not history. But if somebody asks me direct questions, I'm not going to lie." "I would not ask you to lie," Stephen said. "I'm not asking you to protect me. I'm telling you because I intend to tell the people here myself, before someone else does." Haley looked at him with a kind of surprised respect. "That's a harder road," Haley said. "It's the right one," Stephen said. He told Sheriff Randall Hicks the following morning in full. It took an hour. Hicks sat behind his desk and listened without interrupting and then was quiet for a long time. "You were 19, Hicks said finally. "That's not an excuse," Stephen said. "It's context." "The testimony was accurate," Hicks said. "Yes." "The man was guilty." "Yes." "And he died, and his family lost their provider, and I spent the next 12 years building a life that I could stand in front of, and I owe his family something I cannot repay, and I am fully aware that all of that is true simultaneously." Hicks was quiet again for another long stretch. "You are a better deputy than I have any right to expect," Hicks said finally. "And you are a more honest man than most people who carry less. Your badge stays where it is, but I want it on the formal record." "Agreed," Stephen said. He left the office and walked to Ezra Bloom's store and sent a letter by the next railroad to Tom Fairley's widow in Abilene, whose address Haley had provided, enclosing the equivalent of 3 months' wages and an account of what he owed and why, in the plainest language he could manage. He was not sure she would accept it. He was not sure it was enough. He sent it anyway, because it was what he could do and he had put it off for too long. And then he went to Matilda Keller's farm. She was at the fence line when he arrived, mending a section that had taken damage in the last frost, and she put down her tools and looked at him as he dismounted, and she must have read something in his face because she said without preamble, "Tell me." He told her everything. Standing by her fence in the January cold, he gave her the full account, the same one he had given Hicks, plus the letter he had sent that morning, plus the full interior weight of 12 years of carrying it. He did not ask for absolution, he did not soften it, he told it straight. She was quiet for a long time after he finished. "You were 19, she said. "Hicks said the same thing," he said. "It doesn't resolve it." "No," she said, "it doesn't resolve it, but it is true and it matters, and the difference between who you were at 19 and who you are now is not nothing, Stephen. That difference is actually what character is." He looked at her. The cold air moved between them. "I need you to know something," she said. "I value honesty more than I value a clean record. A man who has made a mistake and carried it honestly, and finally done the right thing with it, is considerably more trustworthy to me than a man who has made no mistakes, because he has never done anything hard enough to risk one." He did not speak for a moment because the relief of being heard without being diminished was, it turned out, a powerful thing, and it had come on him unexpectedly. "I have been wanting to tell you for 2 months," he said. "I know," she said. "I could see you carrying it." "You said as much," he said, "on the porch in November." "I did," she said. "And now you've told me, and it changes nothing about what I already knew of you, which is considerable." He took a breath of cold January air. "Matilda," he said, and his voice was different, lower and more direct, without the careful professional distance he had been maintaining. "I need you to know that what I feel for you has nothing to do with the job or the road I ride or any reason that could be filed in a report." She looked at him steadily. "I know that too," she said. "I have known it for some time." And he said, "And," she said with a measured carefulness that was not coldness but rather the deliberate quality of a woman who did not speak without meaning it, "I am not indifferent to you, Stephen Malone. I want you to know that plainly." It was not a declaration. It was something more durable than a declaration, an acknowledgement between two careful people that something real was there, and that they were both willing to be honest about it. He reached out and touched her hand where it rested on the fence rail, and she turned her hand over and let his close around it, and they stood there in the January cold with the bare branches of the cottonwoods moving overhead, and it was, by any measure, a beginning. February was a month of small, significant advancements. He came to her farm now without pretexts, which both of them acknowledged quietly and without ceremony as a change in the rules of engagement. They talked for hours about their respective histories and futures, about the farm and what she wanted it to become, about the law and what he believed it should mean, and what he had seen it fail to be. They argued, occasionally and productively, about things like the proper management of creek bottomland and the question of whether the new railroad policies were beneficial or predatory. And the arguments were pleasant in the specific way that arguments are pleasant when both parties are operating in genuine good faith. He did not rush toward what was between them. He did not believe in rushing. And she, who had been on her own for 3 years and had built something of herself in that time that she was not going to put aside lightly, was not in a hurry either. There was a quality of patience between them that coexisted with a constant, heightened awareness of each other that was the opposite of indifference. He kissed her for the first time in late February in her kitchen, when they had been arguing mildly about something that neither of them would later be able to name, and the argument had trailed off into a silence that was full of something, and he had simply turned toward her, and she had turned toward him, and they had met in the middle without either of them quite being the one to initiate it. It was a brief kiss, warm and deliberate, and when they separated they both stood there for a moment with the quiet astonishment of people who have confirmed something they were fairly sure about but which turns out to be considerably more consequential than the theoretical version of it. "Well," she said. "Yes," he said. They looked at each other. "Again," she said, and this time there was no ambiguity about who had initiated it. March came in like something that had been waiting. The cattle drive season started early, which meant Caldwell Creek filled up with the noise and commerce and occasional mayhem of the trail. Stephen's days grew longer and more demanding, and the hours at Matilda's farm became something he looked forward to with an urgency that had nothing patient about it. He was aware that he was in love with her. He was aware that this awareness was altering him in ways that were not reversible and that he did not particularly want to reverse. She was aware of it too. He knew she was because she had told him so directly without theater, one evening when they were sitting by her fireplace after supper, and she had said, "I am falling in love with you, and I want you to know that I take that seriously, and I want to know if you take it seriously too." He had said, "I take it as seriously as anything I have ever done." She had nodded once and leaned her head against his shoulder, which was a small gesture but which contained, in the particular language of people who do not make small gestures without meaning them, a very large amount of information. The Kurt Ferris situation had not fully resolved itself. Doyle had returned from San Antonio and had, when Stephen had a quiet conversation with him, made clear that Kurt's behavior in December was not Doyle's position. Doyle Ferris was a man who operated out of self-interest, and his self-interest told him that antagonizing a deputy was a losing proposition. He had, in his way, managed Kurt through the winter, but Kurt Ferris had a particular kind of resentment that managed itself rather than being managed, which is to say it went underground and fermented. By the end of March it had fermented into a specific plan, which was not violent but was calculated, and which had to do with the land deed. In April, a man arrived at the county land office claiming to have a prior deed to Matilda's 40 acres, predating her purchase from the estate. The claim was on paper with a signature, and it was a forgery, but it was a good enough forgery to create official uncertainty, which was Kurt's actual goal. Not to take the land but to create a legal complication that would require Matilda to spend money she did not have on a legal process that could drag on for months. Stephen found out about it when the county land agent, a nervous man named Jeffrey Sparks, came to the sheriff's office, and said he didn't know what to do. "Sit on it," Stephen said. "Don't process anything until I have a look." He took the counterclaim document to Matilda the same afternoon. She read it at her kitchen table with the careful attention she gave to everything, and her jaw tightened in a way he had come to recognize as controlled anger. "This signature is wrong," she said. "I have my deed from Austin. I have the original estate documentation. This prior claim is dated to a period when Roy McKell was still alive and recorded as sole owner. It cannot be a legitimate prior deed." "I know that," he said. "Getting the land office to process that logic formally will take time." "How much time?" "Depends on how far Kurt is willing to push it. If he files with the county court, it could take months." She was quiet for a moment, her hands flat on the table. "He is trying to exhaust me financially," she said. "Yes," Stephen said. "It's a trap, an expensive, drawn-out trap. Is there a way to cut it short?" He had spent the ride out from town thinking about this. "The original McKell estate records are in San Antonio," he said, "in the district records office. They would definitively establish that no prior deed existed. If we can get a certified copy from the district office, the counterclaim collapses at the county level before it ever reaches a court." "How long would that take?" 3 or 4 days with a fast rider." "Then go," she said. He raised an eyebrow. "I need Hicks to authorize it as official business." "Then get Hicks to authorize it," she said, and the directness of it was so characteristic of her that he almost smiled. "I will ride out tomorrow morning," he said. He went to San Antonio, rode hard, got the certified records from the district office in 2 days, and was back in Caldwell Creek by the end of the 4th day. The counterclaim was presented to Jeffrey Sparks with the district certification, and a written note from Stephen that amounted to a very clear indication of where the investigation had led. Sparks processed the dismissal with considerable relief. The counterclaim was rejected before it ever reached the county court. Kurt Ferris, when he found out, rode to town and confronted Stephen outside the sheriff's office in a way that was more theater than real threat. He was angry and loud and ultimately helpless, because the legal process had worked correctly, and there was nothing to challenge. Doyle Ferris appeared shortly thereafter, and the expression on Doyle's face when he looked at his brother was the expression of a man calculating the exact financial and social cost of Kurt's behavior and finding the number alarming. "It's done," Stephen said to Doyle, with a brevity that was both a statement and a warning. "Keep it done." Doyle Ferris looked at his brother, then at Stephen, and then he took Kurt by the arm and walked him away, and that was effectively the end of the Ferris trouble. Matilda was standing on her porch when Stephen rode down to tell her. She was already smiling, which meant Hannah Pruitt had gotten there first, because Hannah Pruitt had a gift for rapid information distribution that the railroad telegraph could not match. "Hannah told you," he said. "Half an hour ago," she said. He dismounted and came up the steps, and she put her hands on either side of his face and kissed him with a warmth and directness that left no room for ambiguity about what she felt. "Thank you," she said. "You would have fought it yourself," he said. "You would have won." "Yes," she said, "but it would have cost me money and months of my life. You gave me back both. That matters to me." He stayed for supper. He stayed for the evening. He stayed until the late hour when the responsible thing was to ride back to town. And when he did, they stood at the door in the dark, her hand in his, and they talked quietly about the summer coming, and about what the farm would look like with the bottomland properly planted, and about things that stretched forward in time in ways that people talk about only when they believe in the forward direction together. May was planting season, and June was the beginning of the heat. And through both of them, Stephen and Matilda were together in the way that 2 people are together when they have stopped arguing with the fact of it. He was at her farm most evenings when his duties allowed, and on Sundays after church he helped with whatever the farm needed, not because he was performing helpfulness, but because it was her farm and the things that mattered to her had become things that mattered to him, which is a different and more significant condition. She was changing him. He was aware of it without resisting it. The years of hardness he had built over the compact, the keeping of distance, the professional containment of everything that might be vulnerable, were not dissolving so much as becoming unnecessary. He still had the quietness and the authority and the instincts that made him good at his work. But the work was no longer the wall around him. It was just the work. He told her he loved her on a June evening when the heat lay across the bottomland like a weight, and they were sitting on her porch, watching the fireflies come up in the tall grass by the creek. He said it without preparation or ceremony, in the middle of a silence, because the silence was the right moment for it. She turned to look at him. "I love you," she said back, and in her voice was the same quality it had when she said things she had thought carefully about and was ready to stake something on. The summer advanced. The farm flourished with the bottomland doing exactly what bottomland does when it is properly managed by someone who knows what she is doing. The corn came in strong. The kitchen garden was abundant. She sold enough at the Caldwell Creek market to make the farm financially sound for its second year, which she had planned for, but which arriving at was still a satisfaction she allowed herself to feel. Stephen began to understand, over the course of that summer, what it meant to want a future with someone in the concrete rather than the abstract. Not a future in the sense of what might eventually happen, but the specific future of this woman and this land and this county, a future that had a permanent shape to it. He thought about this with the same careful quality that he brought to everything that mattered. He thought about the fact that she had come west to build something of her own, and that she had done it, and that the value of what she had built depended on it being hers, and not being absorbed into or subsumed by someone else's story. He thought about how to love someone without reducing them. He did not arrive at any of this quickly or romantically. He arrived at it the way he arrived at most important conclusions, through sustained honest thinking applied to something he cared about enough to think carefully about. In August, he had a conversation with Randall Hicks about his long-term intentions in Caldwell Creek. "You've been here 4 years," Hicks said. "You could apply for sheriff next election. I'm not planning to run again." Stephen thought about this. "I might," he said, "if the county wants it." "The county would take it," Hicks said. "You know that." He did know that. It was a different kind of stability from the deputy's position, which was appointed, and the thought of it had a different quality, something more established, more rooted, more like the kind of life you build when you intend to stay. It was around this time, in the August heat, that Matilda said something that opened the question they had both been thinking about without yet naming. They were in her kitchen, late in the evening, the heat making the night heavy and slow, and she was mending a work shirt by lamplight, and he was sitting across from her reading the weekly paper, which was 3 days late because the railroad had been delayed by a track repair, and the domestic ordinariness of it was so complete and so comfortable that he looked up from the paper and felt something tighten in his chest with the specific quality of something that is almost too good to trust. "What are you thinking?" she asked, not looking up from the mending. "That I would like this to be permanent," he said. She looked up then, her hands stilled on the shirt. "Permanent how?" She said with that precision that was always her at her most careful. "Married," he said. "If that is something you want, I'm not going to ask you to give up anything of what you've built or fold your life into mine. I want to fold mine into yours if you'll have it that way. This is your land, your farm, your work. I would be adding myself to it, not the other way around." She was quiet for a long moment, looking at him with the full, assessing quality of her attention. "You have thought about this carefully," she said. "I have thought about little else for 2 months," he said. A slow smile came onto her face, the rare, full kind that was not her everyday expression but which, when it appeared, was the most valuable thing in any room it was in. "Yes," she said. "That is what I want." He let out a breath. "I would like you to ask properly," she added, which was not a ceremony requirement so much as a genuine preference for formality on things that mattered, and which he understood perfectly. He put down the paper and came around the table and went down on one knee, which felt both absurd and entirely correct, and took her hand, and asked her properly. She said yes a second time, with a completeness to it that left nothing ambiguous. They were married in September of 1883 in the Caldwell Creek church by a minister who had to borrow a chair for his excess congregation because the whole town had apparently decided to attend. Hannah Prout cried, which she would afterward deny. Randall Hicks stood up with Stephen. The widow Agnes Moore, who had befriended Matilda in the market through an ongoing appreciation of her bottomland corn, stood up with Matilda, and the morning was clear and cool with the first real hint of autumn, and the light came through the church windows in that specific way. It comes through in September when everything is still green, but beginning to turn. After the ceremony and the reception at the hotel, which Ezra Bloom organized with more enthusiasm than anyone had expected from him, they rode back to the farm together in the late afternoon light, the two of them on horseback side by side with the whole county quiet around them, and Matilda looked over at him and said, "You may want to move your things from the boarding house." "I had rather planned to," he said. "Good," she said. They arrived at the farm as the sun was getting low, and the creek was running gold with the late light, and the farmhouse stood solid and clean against the sky, and she looked at it with the proprietary satisfaction of someone who had built something that had proved itself. And then she looked at him with something that was not proprietary at all, but was its own particular kind of certainty, and it was one of those moments that does not require any words around it. Now this brings us forward, 9 months further, to the night of the flooded creek. Because the good life is not a life without difficulty, and the summer of the following year, 1884, had brought a complication that Stephen had not anticipated, and which had tested, in a specific and revealing way, what they were to each other. The spring of 1884 had brought an unusually wet season to central Texas. The creek behind Matilda's farmhouse had flooded twice in March, and the bottomland had suffered, and the replanting had consumed April and half of May. The farm work doubled in the wet season, and Stephen had simultaneously taken on the sheriff's position, as Hicks had not run again, and the county election in March had gone to Stephen by a margin that surprised nobody but him. Being sheriff was a more demanding position than deputy in ways that went beyond hours. It carried a weight of public accountability that Stephen took with complete seriousness, which meant that through the spring and into the summer he was carrying more than he had previously, and giving it the full measure of his attention. Matilda understood this. She was not a woman who required constant attention or who was made anxious by a husband who worked hard. But understanding something and not feeling the effects of it are different conditions, and by June there was a distance between them that was small but that she could feel the edges of, a quality of Stephen being present but slightly abstracted, his mind on the job even when his body was home. She had not said anything about it, which was its own kind of thing, because she was not someone who did not say things when they needed saying. The fact that she had not said it told him, when he began to notice the distance himself, that she was not sure how to say it without it sounding like a complaint about his work, which she did not feel it was exactly a complaint about his work, and she was trying to find the right language for it. The wrong language arrived before the right language did. In early July, there was a situation in town involving a traveling medicine show that had sold fraudulent remedies to a number of townspeople, which was a common and infuriating variety of frontier grift. Stephen had been dealing with the aftermath for several days: affidavits, documentation, coordination with a county judge in another town. He was tired and stretched thin and somewhat short of his usual patience when he came home one evening to find that Matilda had, in his absence, accepted help from a neighboring farmer named Grant Holloway in mending the north fence line, which had gone down again in a storm. This was entirely reasonable. Grant Holloway was a decent neighbor who helped people when asked, and the fence needed mending, and Stephen had been 3 days unavailable. But something in him, tired and strung too tight, and not yet the man he wanted to be in that moment, said something about it that came out with an edge that had nothing to do with Grant Holloway and everything to do with things that had been accumulating in him since March without being addressed. Something about preferring to know when people were coming to the property. Something that came out sounding in the exhausted way things can come out, like distrust of her judgment. She went very still. "Excuse me," she said, with the precise quiet that was her at her most controlled, which he knew by now was the precursor to something very truthful. He heard himself and felt the words land wrong and started to pull back. But she was already talking, and what she said was not unfair, was in fact entirely accurate, was a precise accounting of the distance that had grown between them through the spring and what it had felt like from her side. And it was delivered with the specific pain of someone who has been carrying something they shouldn't have had to carry alone. And at the end of it came the line about his dark past and keeping the world at arm's length, which arrived with the sharpness of things that are true and hurt precisely because they are true. He stood in the doorway for too long after she closed it. He went back to town. He worked. He did not sleep well. He spent 2 days going over the conversation in his mind and arriving at the same conclusion from every angle, which was that she was right, and that he had let the sheriff work colonize the space that should have been theirs, and that he had done it because being useful to the public was a way of not having to sit with the terror of how much he had at stake in this marriage. Because that was the truth underneath it, the specific dark truth he had not wanted to look at directly, that loving her as completely as he did had made him afraid in a way that his whole professional armor had been built to prevent. And when he was afraid, he worked. And when he worked, he disappeared behind the badge. And she was right. That was not fair to her. On the 3rd day, a storm system came in from the west. A serious storm, not the drizzle of autumn, but the full heavy wall of a late summer Texas deluge, the kind that turns creeks into rivers in an hour. It built through the afternoon and broke after dark, and by midnight it was extraordinary, the kind of rain that makes you aware of how many things have drainage problems. He thought about the creek. He thought about the farmhouse on the far bank with the low window, and the lamp that had been burning in that window when he went to sleep at night for the past year, which was her custom on the evenings he was in town late. She left the lamp burning in the window, a signal that he could read from the main road that all was well. And tonight, in this storm, there would be no lamp, because the creek would have flooded and there would be no light from the main road to the farm, and she would be alone in the dark in a farmhouse that still had a weather vulnerability on the northeast corner of the roof, even after the repairs. He told himself it was practical. He told himself he was the sheriff and the road south was his to maintain. He told himself it had nothing to do with the fact that he had been a fool and was tired of being a fool. He got on his horse. He rode south in the rain. The creek, when he reached it, was exactly what he had known it would be, 3 feet over the bank and running fast and black with the current, the normal crossing completely underwater. He could hear it from 40 yards away. He stood there for a moment, the rain falling in solid walls around him, the lamp in his saddlebag wrapped in an oilskin. A rational man would wait until morning. He was in his saddlebag before he finished the thought, checking the oilskin on the lamp. The lamp was good. He was going to be wet regardless. The current was fast, but the creek at flood was not deep, not here, and he knew the bottom of this particular crossing in the way that a man knows a piece of ground he has crossed hundreds of times. He went into the water. It was cold in the way that July floods are cold, not winter cold, but cold enough. And the current grabbed at him with the serious, impersonal force of moving water that does not know or care about the significance of what it is trying to knock over. He went in on horseback and made it 2/3 across before the horse, a steady animal, hit a particularly violent pull of current and pitched sideways. And then Stephen was in the water himself, one hand on the saddlebag with the lamp, one hand reaching for anything, and the current was taking him sideways and downstream. He did not panic, because panic in moving water is how people drown. He let the current carry him sideways and worked toward the far bank with controlled strokes, the lamp above his head, and after what felt like considerably longer than it probably was, he caught the bank grass and pulled himself out 12 yards downstream from the crossing. He was soaked to the bone. The lamp was still burning inside the oilskin. His horse had made the crossing 30 seconds after him, apparently unimpressed by the drama. He wrung out his coat as much as was possible, retrieved his horse, and walked up the bank toward the farmhouse, and that is where we began, with Stephen Malone pulling himself out of the flooded creek at 2 minutes past midnight, water streaming from his coat, heading for Matilda's window. He set the lamp on her windowsill. He turned to go. The door opened. She stood in the doorway with the rifle and the blanket and her dark hair loose, and they looked at each other across the wet, dark yard. And then she said the thing about him almost drowning himself. "I have crossed worse," he said, which was not entirely true. She looked at him for a long, still moment, the rain easing around them to something quieter, and then she said, "Get inside before you die of cold, Stephen Malone, and then you are going to tell me the truth, all of it." He walked toward the light. Inside, she pushed him toward the fireplace, which she had already gotten going, because she had heard the rain change and gotten up, which meant she had been awake, which meant she had not been sleeping well either. She went to the bedroom and came back with a dry shirt and a blanket and his spare trousers that he kept here because this was, after all, his home. "Change," she said. "I am making coffee." He changed in front of the fire, dripping onto the hearthstone. And by the time the coffee was ready, he was wrapped in the blanket and warm enough to feel the full extent of how cold he had been, which arrived as a wave of shaking that he rode out with his jaw set. She sat down across from him with the 2 cups and looked at him, and the lamp was between them on the table, still burning, and outside the rain was dropping toward silence. "The lamp," she said. "Why did you bring me a lamp?" "Your light was out," he said. "Yours is always in the window when I'm coming from the night road. Tonight it was dark." She was quiet. "You came across a flooded creek at midnight," she said slowly, "because my window was dark and you wanted me to have a light." "Yes," he said. She looked at the lamp and then at him, and her eyes were doing something complicated. "Stephen," she said, "that is not a practical thing. That is not a sheriff's errand. What is that?" "It's an apology," he said. "Not adequate. I know it's not adequate. I'm not saying it replaces the conversation or the things I got wrong. I'm saying I wanted you to have a light. That is the entire thing. I wanted you not to be in the dark." She pressed her lips together and he could see her sorting through something, and then she set down her cup and came around the table and sat down next to him close, and she said, "Tell me what's been happening inside you since March. The real version." Not the sheriff version, so he told her. He told her the thing he had not managed to say during the argument, which was the specific fear underneath the work, the way loving her completely had made him terrified of the cost, and how he had handled the terror by being useful to everyone except her, because being useful was armor and loving her had made him understand that armor was exactly the wrong posture in a marriage. She listened to all of it without interrupting. When he was done, she was quiet for a moment, looking at the lamp. "I have been afraid too," she said. "I did not say anything about the distance because I was afraid that saying it would sound like I was asking you to be less than you are in your work, and I did not want that. I was trying to find the right words and I ran out of time." "We both ran out of time," he said. "We are here now," she said. "We are here now," he agreed. She leaned against him, her head on his shoulder, the same gesture she had made in January of the previous year by her fence, the gesture that contained a large amount of information. "You crossed a flooded creek," she said, half to herself. "I would cross worse," he said, and this time it was entirely true. She laughed briefly and quietly, the laugh that was not her public laugh but the private one that she gave only when something reached her when her guard was down. "I love you," she said. "That has not changed. It will not change." "I love you," he said. "I am sorry I made you feel like you were second to the work. You have never been second to anything." She lifted her head and looked at him close, the firelight on her face. "We are going to have this conversation again," she said. "In the morning properly, about the practical arrangements, about how we do this going forward when the work is heavy." "Yes," he said, "all of it, whatever you need to say." "Good," she said. "But not tonight." "No," he said, "not tonight." She tucked the blanket around him with a practicality that was also tenderness, and they sat by the fire as the rain finished its business outside, and the lamp burned steadily between them, and neither of them felt the need to fill the quiet with anything. The conversation in the morning was the kind that establishes a new set of working principles between two people who are serious about each other. It took 2 hours and covered the practical, the emotional, and the structural, and it was not entirely comfortable in places, and it was also one of the most honest exchanges they had yet had, which is saying something for two people who had been conducting themselves with considerable honesty from early on. They agreed on things. He would be more vocal about when the work was consuming him, rather than retreating into it silently. She would say directly when the distance was becoming a problem, rather than waiting for the right language. They would set aside Sunday evenings as non-negotiable regardless of what the week had brought, not for any formal reason but simply because it was necessary to have something in the week that was theirs alone. And, she said at the end of it, "You are going to learn to accept that I can manage this farm when you are occupied, and that asking for a neighbor's help with a fence line is not a reflection on you." "I know that," he said. "Say it anyway," she said, out loud. "You can manage this farm and everything on it," he said, "and my not being here is never a failure of yours or mine. You have been managing this land since before I was in it, and I married you because I admire the person you are when you are doing it." She looked at him. "Better," she said. They had a late breakfast, because the morning had been taken up with conversation and neither had eaten, and Stephen rode back to town in the dry, clear air that always follows a Texas storm. The sky washed to an extraordinary blue, the road gleaming with moisture, and he felt light in a way he had not felt since March, which is the specific lightness of having put down something heavy and heavy you had been carrying so long you had forgotten you were carrying it. The months that followed were different. Not perfect, because life is not a project that can be brought to a state of completion, but genuinely different in the way that things are different when the underlying issue has been addressed rather than worked around. He was more present, in the specific way that requires active choice rather than simply the absence of distraction. She was more openly warm than she had been in the careful early days, which was the natural development of trust that had been built correctly over time, and was now deep enough to be expressed without caution. Autumn came again to Caldwell Creek, the second autumn of their marriage, and with it a piece of news that arrived in early October and which changed the landscape of things in a way that was profound, and also, it turned out, exactly right. Matilda told him on a Tuesday morning before he left for town, standing in the kitchen with her coffee cup and a directness that was completely characteristic. "I am expecting a child," she said. "I believe sometime in the spring." He stood very still for a moment. She watched him, with the attention she always gave to things she was uncertain about but was willing to wait out. "Spring," he said. "I would estimate May," she said. He set down his own cup and came around the table and took both her hands, and he looked at her with the full weight of everything he felt, which was more than he had vocabulary for in that moment. "Are you well?" he said. "Completely well," she said. "Tired sometimes, but well." "You will tell me when that changes," he said, "in either direction." "I will tell you," she said. He held her hands for another moment and then pulled her into his arms, and she let him, leaning in with the ease of a year of practice at being held by this particular person. "May," he said again, into her hair. "Give or take," she said. "We will need to look at the northeast corner of the roof again before winter," he said, because this was how his mind worked, moving immediately to the practical things that would make things safe for her, and she laughed against his chest. "Already planning," she said. "Always," he said. The winter of 1884 into 1885 was a gentle one by Texas standards, and they moved through it together with the particular warmth of a house that has something coming. He fixed the roof corner and reinforced the porch steps, and ordered 2 additional cords of wood. She kept the farm running through the cold months with her usual efficiency, modified for the growing situation in pragmatic ways that she managed without drama. She was the same person pregnant that she had been before, which is to say determined and practical and not inclined to be managed. And he learned fairly quickly that the correct approach was to make sure everything was ready and available, and then get out of the way of her doing exactly what she intended to do, which was everything she had always done. What he could offer was presence and reliability, and the lamp in the window on the nights when she needed to know she was not alone in whatever this was. He thought often that winter about Tom Fairley's sons in Abilene. The letter he had sent the year before had received a response, eventually, from Tom Fairley's widow, whose name was Clara. It was a brief letter. It acknowledged the payment. It said neither that it was enough nor that it wasn't, but it also said something toward the end that he had read many times, that she was glad to know Tom had been remembered by someone outside the family, and that her boys were doing well, and that she hoped Stephen Malone was doing well also. He had written back. They had now exchanged 3 letters, and while the correspondence was carefully formal, it had the quality of something that had been in darkness being brought into a limited but genuine light. He was not absolved. He had not expected absolution. But there was a reckoning happening across a decade and a distance, and it had a different weight than the sealed, unaddressed thing he had carried alone. He told Matilda about the correspondence on a cold February night, and she listened as she always did with the full quality of her attention. "I am glad you reached out," she said. "The reaching out matters." She did not have to respond, he said. She responded because it was the truth, Matilda said, and people recognize the truth when it comes to them honestly. You gave her the honest version and she gave you one back. Her boys are 14 and 16 now, he said. Old enough to make their own choices about what they want to do with it, she said. Yes, he said. They sat with it for a while. You are not the same person who made that testimony, she said. I mean that specifically, not as consolation. I have seen you operate as a lawman for 2 years. I have watched you make decisions in situations where the easy choice and the right choice were not the same thing. You choose the right one every time. That is not the behavior of a man who hasn't learned from his past. I am trying, he said. You are doing, she corrected gently. May arrived on schedule and so did their son. He was born on a warm May morning when the bottomland corn was already knee-high and the creek was running green and steady, and the sky above Texas was the specific blue that made you understand why people came west and stayed. The birth was managed with the help of Hannah Prout, who had delivered enough frontier babies to be entirely competent, and by a midwife from town named Mrs. Gantry, and it was not easy, but it went as well as such things go when the people involved know what they are doing, and the mother is a woman of extraordinary physical determination. Stephen was outside on the porch for the final hours because this was the done thing in 1885, and also because standing inside the room feeling helpless was going to give him a very controlled version of panic that would not help anyone. He sat on the porch steps with his hat in his hands and listened to the sounds of the house and thought about every choice that had brought him here. The compact he had broken, the creek he had crossed, the woman he had somehow been granted the gift of being loved by. When Hannah opened the door and said, "Come in, Sheriff," with a smile that contained a considerable amount of information, he was inside before she finished the sentence. Matilda was sitting up against the pillows, tired in the specific exhausted way of someone who has done an enormous amount of work and done it successfully, and in her arms was a small, red-faced, entirely complete person who was making the particular sounds of someone who has opinions and intends to express them. She looked up at Stephen, and her face had the look he had learned was her at her fullest, her most present, the look that appeared when she was doing something she had meant. "Come here," she said. He came. He sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his son, and the world rearranged itself somewhat, which is what it does on those occasions. "He looks like he has opinion," Stephen said. "He does," she said. "He takes after his mother. He looked at her and she was smiling, the full rare kind. "What shall we call him?" she asked. "Thomas," he said, and she understood immediately without asking, and she looked at him with the eyes that saw him clearly and completely and said, "Thomas." "Yes." "Thomas James Malone," he said. "James for your father." She reached up and put her hand against his face, and he turned his head and pressed a kiss to her palm in the way he had learned was what she needed when words were not sufficient. "Thomas James," she said softly, looking at the baby. "Hello." Thomas James Malone expressed his opinion of the name by producing a sound of significant volume, and Hannah Prout, tactfully waiting by the door, laughed and said she would put the coffee on. The years that followed were years in Caldwell Creek, in the ordinary and extraordinary sense. Stephen served as sheriff of the county, and the county grew with the railroad years, and the work was heavy and important, and he carried it without losing himself in it, which was a thing he had learned to do, and which required regular maintenance, the same as any system that matters. He made Sunday evenings non-negotiable and kept his word on all the other things they had agreed to by the fireplace on the morning after the flooded creek. He received a letter from Clara Fairley in the autumn of 1886, longer than the previous ones, in which she said her older son, who was now 17, had asked about Stephen Malone and what had happened, and that she had told him the full account as she knew it. The son, whose name was also Thomas, had apparently sat with it for a while, and then said that he thought Stephen Malone had done what he could with what he had, and that he wasn't going to carry a stranger's grief about it. Clara said she thought this was probably the right conclusion and that she hoped Stephen could arrive at the same one. He sat with that letter for a long time. He showed it to Matilda. Read it and looked at him. "She is releasing you," she said. "You should let yourself be released." "I am working on it," he said. "I know," she said. "Take the time you need, but know that the release is real." He took the time. He got there. In the spring of 1887, Matilda told him she was expecting again. She told him in the same direct morning manner, standing in the kitchen, and this time he was faster. He came around the table immediately and took her hands and said, "How are you feeling?" "Tired and rather pleased," she said. "When? October, I think." He smiled, and she smiled back. And Thomas, who was 2 and on his feet and apparently of the opinion that any interesting exchange happening in the kitchen required his physical participation, came toddling over and grabbed both their legs and said, "Mama," with the authority of a person who had established certain priorities and intended to maintain them. Stephen picked him up and held him, and Thomas looked at him with his mother's eyes, direct and fully attentive, and said, "Papa," with complete satisfaction. "Yes," Stephen said, "that's right." October arrived as promised, and with it a daughter. She arrived on a crisp October evening when the leaves on the cottonwoods along the creek were turning yellow and the air smelled of wood smoke and ripening apples, and she arrived with a directness and clarity that was, from the first moment, entirely characteristic of a person who knew what she was about. They named her Eleanor Rose. Thomas regarded Eleanor with the careful suspicion of a 2-year-old who has been displaced as the primary subject of parental attention and is undecided about this development, which eventually, over the weeks that followed, resolved itself into a proprietary interest that expressed itself primarily through standing next to her basket and informing anyone present of what she was doing. Life on the farm and in the county expanded with its people in it. Stephen learned over the years to be the sheriff the county needed while remaining the husband and father that his family needed, and the balance was not a static thing, but a living practice that required attention, the way anything worth having requires attention. He was not always perfect at it. Neither was she. But they were both honest about it, and they were both trying, which is the actual substance of a good marriage when the ceremony is done and the real work begins. Matilda continued to work the farm with the same precision and determination she had brought to it from the beginning. The bottomland became something of a local institution, her corn and kitchen garden products known at the Caldwell Creek market and beyond. She hired 2 hands in the busier seasons, both women who had arrived in the county under difficult circumstances and needed steady work, and she paid them fairly and managed them well. She also, in the autumn of 1888, began teaching reading to a small group of adults at the church on Thursday evenings, which she organized because she noticed that several people in the county had been managing without literacy, and that this was both unnecessary and a limitation on their lives. She had not been asked to do this. She simply saw the need and addressed it, which was entirely characteristic. He watched her do it, and the admiration he had felt for her since the day she climbed down from that cracked-axle wagon and examined the wheel with focused competence had, over 6 years, become something so layered and deep that it was no longer separable from the fundamental structure of who he was. He told her this one evening in their kitchen with the children asleep, in the blunt and slightly awkward way that he expressed things that were too large for elegant sentences. "You are the making of me," he said. "I want you to know that. Not in the sense that you rescued me from something, I don't mean that. I mean that the person I wanted to become, that I had been working toward for years, I did not finish becoming him until I had you to be him with." She looked at him for a long moment. "That is the most," she said, and then she stopped. "Yes," he said. She came to sit beside him at the table close, and she said, "You are the reason I stayed in one place. I had been prepared to keep moving. That's what I had decided, forward motion, remember. And you made me want to stop moving and plant things. You planted things before you met me," he said. "The literal kind," she said. "Yes, but you know what I mean." He did know what she meant. "I am glad you stopped," he said. "I am glad I crossed the flooded creek," she said, with the particular private amusement of someone who had appropriated a specific image for her own meaning. "I crossed the flooded creek," he said. "You crossed it for me," she said. "I crossed it by staying." He thought about this. "That's better than my version," he said. "It usually is," she said, and the smile was the full, rare, private kind, and he kissed her in the firelight of their kitchen in their house on their land, with their children sleeping down the hall, and outside the creek ran steady and quiet in the October dark. Caldwell Creek grew and changed as the decade turned. The 1890s brought new settlers, new disputes, new challenges to the county's management. Stephen served as sheriff through 2 more election cycles, and when he finally handed the badge to his chosen successor, a young man of 29 named Ben Crawford who had the right instincts and the willingness to develop them, he did it without regret. He was 44 by then, and the farm had been needing his full attention for some time. He went home and told Matilda, and she looked at him with the eyes that saw him clearly and said, "How does it feel?" "Like I'm where I'm supposed to be," he said. "You have been where you're supposed to be for some time," she said. But now the address is official. They had built the farm into something significant over the years. The original 40 acres had grown, through careful and legal purchase, to 85, and the bottomland was producing reliably, and the hands were good, and the operation was the kind that runs on the combined knowledge and relationship of people who have been doing it together for a long time. Thomas was 12 and already as interested in the farm as in anything, which Matilda found satisfying and Stephen found moving in a way he did not entirely have language for, because to see his son learning the same land his mother had built was to see a kind of continuity that went deeper than words. Eleanor was 10 and had her mother's precision and her father's instinct for reading a situation, which was a formidable combination in a 10-year-old, and suggested remarkable things about who she was going to become. There had been a third child, a son named Robert, born in 1891, who was now 3 and who was at the stage of life in which every interesting object is a thing to put into your mouth and every door is a thing to open, and who had taken Stephen's quiet temperament and Matilda's focused attention and combined them into a personality that was simultaneously calm and completely unstoppable. The letter from Clara Fairley's son, Thomas Fairley Jr., arrived in 1893. He was 24 by then, working as a surveyor in Kansas, and he wrote to say that he had thought about it for some time and that he wanted Stephen to know there was no grievance. He wrote it plainly and without performance, the letter of a practical young man who had decided what he thought about something and was communicating it directly. He said his father's death had been hard for his family, but that he had come to understand that the choices made in that room in Abilene 20 years ago had not been made with malice, and that the subsequent years of Stephen's work in Texas were their own accounting of what a man could make of a second chance. Stephen read the letter twice, and then he folded it carefully and put it in the box where he kept the things that mattered most, alongside Matilda's first letter to him, written in the winter of their first year when he had been in San Antonio getting the McKell records, 2 pages in her precise handwriting that had told him in plain and careful terms that she had decided she was in love with him, and that she thought he ought to know. He had been carrying Tom Fairley's death for 23 years. He let it go. He stood in the front yard of his farm on an October morning in 1893, the cottonwood leaves falling yellow around him, the creek running bright in the distance, and he felt the specific weightlessness of a thing put down after decades of carrying, and he stood in it for a while. Matilda came out of the house and stood beside him. "You all right?" she said. "I am completely all right," he said, for the first time in a very long time. She looked at him with the eyes that knew everything about him. "The letter," she said. "The letter," he confirmed. She took his hand, and they stood in the October yard together with the leaves coming down and the creek running and the farm sound around them, and the house behind them with their children in it, and the life they had built together in every direction you could look. "Forward motion," she said softly. "And staying," he said. She leaned against his shoulder and they watched the yellow leaves come down in the Texas autumn, and there was nothing between them but the full, settled warmth of 2 people who had chosen each other honestly, maintained that choice through difficulty and time and the specific ordinary challenges of a real life, and had arrived without drama at the thing that all of it had been building toward, which was simply this: the lamp still in the window, the creek still running below the farm, the children inside, the morning starting. And the 2 of them together on the ground they had made theirs. That was enough. That was, in fact, everything.